In the heart of Sweetwater Valley, Wyoming Territory, the deadliest hands in the West belonged to a baker. Sarah McKenzie could pipe roses onto a wedding cake with the same precision her father once used to gun down outlaws. But the Raven gang didn't know that when they kicked in her bakery door, laughing at the little lady who dared refuse their protection racket. They didn't know that before James "Lightning" McKenzie disappeared into legend, he'd taught his daughter more than just how to proof dough and lattice pies. They didn't know that every graceful movement of her fingers, every perfect spiral of frosting, came from the same training that made her father the fastest drawer west of the Mississippi. But they were about to learn the hard way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and gold as Sarah McKenzie pulled another batch of sourdough from her brick oven. The loaves emerged perfect, golden brown crusts concealing soft, airy centers that would make the morning's customers sigh with contentment. Her bakery, tucked into Sweetwater's main street between the general store and the gunsmith's shop, had become the heart of the town's morning rituals. Sarah wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron, pausing to adjust the leather holster hidden beneath it. The weight of her father's Colt was as familiar as the rolling pin she'd just set aside. But unlike the gun, the rolling pin saw daily use. "Morning, Miss McKenzie," old Tom Wells called through the open door, right on schedule for his daily rye loaf. The elderly prospector had been her first customer when she'd opened the bakery. 3 years ago, back when half the town had whispered that James McKenzie's daughter was foolish to choose baking over bounty hunting. "Good morning, Mr. Wells," Sarah smiled, reaching for his usual order. Fresh from the oven, still warm. Tom inhaled deeply, his weathered face creasing with pleasure. "Lord above, girl, you've got magic in those hands. Ain't never tasted bread like yours, not even back east." "Just patience and practice," Sarah replied, though she knew it was more than that. The same steady hands that could pipe delicate sugar flowers had once outshot every man at the county fair. Not that anyone knew it was her. They'd assumed the young boy in borrowed clothes was James McKenzie's apprentice. The morning crowd began filtering in. Mrs. Henderson from the dress shop, Deputy Marshal Clark with his daily cherry Danish, ranch hands seeking meat pies for their saddlebags. Sarah served them all with efficient grace, each movement precise and measured, just as her father had taught her. "Economy of motion," he'd said, whether it was drawing a gun or kneading dough. Through the front window, she spotted 3 strangers lounging against the hitching post. Dark clothes, worn gun belts, the casual arrogance of men used to taking what they wanted, the Raven gang scouts most likely. They'd been pushing into Sweetwater Territory for weeks now, demanding protection fees from local businesses. Mrs. Henderson followed her gaze. "Such rough types," she whispered. "Not proper at all. Do be careful, dear. A young lady alone." Sarah's smile didn't waver, though her spine stiffened. "The bakery keeps me plenty busy, Mrs. Henderson. No time for trouble." She didn't mention the shotgun under the counter, or the hours she still spent practicing with her father's Colt. Let them think her just another shopkeeper's daughter, more concerned with cake pans than cartridges. By mid-morning, the regulars had cleared out, leaving Sarah to prepare for the afternoon rush. She had Mayor Thompson's wife's birthday cake to decorate, 3 dozen dinner rolls for the hotel restaurant, and a wedding cake consultation with the banker's daughter. Normal tasks, peaceful tasks. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah looked up to find one of the strangers filling her doorway, shadow stretching across her clean floor. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nice place you got here, miss," he drawled. "Shame if anything were to happen to it. Times being what they are, businesses need protection." Sarah set down her piping bag, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. "Thank you for your concern," she said coolly. But I managed just fine on my own. The man's smile widened, turned ugly. We'll see about that, little lady. We'll see. He left, boot heels clicking against the wooden sidewalk. Sarah watched him go, her father's voice echoing in her memory. The dangerous ones always telegraph their moves, Sadie girl. Just got to know how to read the signs. She'd read these signs clear enough. Trouble was coming to Sweetwater, whether she wanted it or not. Sarah returned to her work, piping delicate roses onto the mayor's wife's cake. Each petal was perfect, each leaf precisely placed. Just like loading a revolver, no wasted motion, no trembling hands. She'd chosen the baker's life over her father's path, but that didn't mean she'd forgotten his lessons. Evening light slanted through the bakery windows as Sarah cleaned up, casting long shadows across the freshly swept floor. Above the counter hung a worn wanted poster, yellowed with age. Her father's face stared out from it, younger than she remembered him now, but with the same steel in his eyes. James Lightning McKenzie, wanted for justice, the faded text read. She kept it there as both warning and reminder. Upstairs in her living quarters, Sarah opened the cedar chest that held her father's legacy. The smell of gun oil and leather rose from it, mixing with the lingering scent of vanilla and cinnamon from the day's baking. Her fingers traced the intricate scrollwork on her father's spare revolver, a presentation piece from his days as a territorial marshal. "A gun's just a tool, Sadie girl," his voice echoed in her memory, "like your rolling pins and cake molds. It's the hands that matter and the heart behind them." She'd been 12 when he first taught her to shoot, out behind the old family ranch. He'd positioned her small hands on the grip, adjusted her stance with the same patience he'd later use to teach her how to braid pastry and temper chocolate. "Steady now," he'd say, whether she was aiming at targets or decorating her first wedding cake. The sound of breaking glass from the street below snapped Sarah back to the present. Voices carried up, rough, male, drunk. The Raven Gang scouts, making their presence known. She moved to the window, staying in shadow as she'd been taught. 3 men staggered past, bottles in hand, terrorizing the evening quiet with coarse laughter. "I heard Lightning McKenzie used to run these parts," one slurred loudly. "Man so fast he could shoot your gun hand before you cleared leather. Where's the famous Lightning now, eh?" "Gone soft," another spat. "Ain't been seen in these territories for years. Probably dead in a ditch somewhere." Sarah's jaw tightened. They weren't wrong about his absence. James McKenzie had ridden out 2 years ago, chasing rumors of a dangerous fugitive. His letters came sporadically now, posted from distant towns. Each one ended the same way. "Stay safe, stay sharp, and remember what I taught you." She had remembered. Every lesson, every technique, every pearl of wisdom was stored away like ingredients in her pantry, but she'd chosen a different path, hoping to build something that nourished rather than destroyed. The bakery was hers, earned through her own sweat and skill, not her father's reputation, yet that reputation hung over her like a storm cloud. Some folks still crossed the street when they saw her coming, remembering the lightning-fast gunslinger's daughter. Others, like Mrs. Henderson, tried to save her from her father's influence with introductions to suitable young men, as if she needed saving, as if Lightning McKenzie's legacy was a burden rather than a gift. Sarah closed the cedar chest, but not before slipping the presentation revolver into her apron pocket. The weight of it was comforting, familiar. Outside, the Raven Gang scouts had moved on, leaving broken bottles in their wake. Tomorrow she'd hear whispers about it in her shop, concerned citizens clucking their tongues about the declining peace in Sweetwater. Peace had always been an illusion out here. Her father had taught her that too. On the long nights when he'd come home dusty and grim, another notch on his gun, marking another piece of justice served. The West wasn't won with badges and laws alone, it was won by people willing to stand their ground. "You've got lightning in your blood, girl," he'd told her once after she'd won that shooting contest in disguise. But you've got your mama's heart too. That makes you stronger than me. Sarah checked the bakery's locks one final time, then began preparing her starter for tomorrow's bread. Her movements were precise, measured, the same economy of motion that made her father's draw legendary. She had chosen the baker's life, yes, but she was still Lightning McKenzie's daughter. And if the Raven Gang thought they could intimidate her with broken bottles and drunken threats, they were about to learn what that really meant. The Raven Gang's influence crept through Sweetwater like poison in a well. Sarah noticed it in the little things first. The way conversations died when strangers entered the bakery, how the town's children no longer played in the streets after dusk. Even Deputy Marshal Clark's morning visits for Cherry Danish became hurried, his eyes constantly darting to the windows. "Got another business hit last night," he murmured one morning, keeping his voice low. "Peterson's Mercantile refused to pay protection money, found his windows smashed and his storeroom burned." Sarah continued kneading dough, but her movements were shorter, tighter. "How many does that make now?" "4 this week. They're working their way down Main Street." His meaning was clear. The bakery's turn was coming. The bell chimed as Mrs. Peterson herself entered, eyes red-rimmed from crying. Sarah quickly pulled a fresh apple tart from the display case, Catherine Peterson's favorite. "On the house," she said softly, but the older woman shook her head. "You can't afford charity, not with them circling. George says we should have just paid. Maybe he's right. Maybe we were foolish to resist." Sarah's hands stilled on the counter. "There's nothing foolish about standing up for what's yours, Mrs. Peterson. Tell that to my burned storeroom." Catherine's voice cracked. "What good is pride if it costs us everything?" The question haunted Sarah through the afternoon. As she decorated a batch of wedding cookies, her mind worked through options like she was working through a difficult recipe. Her father would have confronted them directly, guns blazing. But she'd seen enough of his justice to know it only led to more violence, an endless cycle of revenge and retribution. When the gang's collector arrived, she was ready. He swaggered in just before closing, all polished boots and oiled mustache. 2 thugs flanked him, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. "Marcus Cross," he introduced himself with a mock bow. "I believe my associates mentioned our protection services." Sarah wiped her hands carefully on her apron. "They did. Would you gentlemen care for some coffee? Fresh apple pie too, just out of the oven." Cross blinked, clearly thrown by the offer. After a moment's hesitation, he settled at the counter, signaling his men to stay by the door. Sarah poured coffee into her best china cups, served perfect wedges of pie on gleaming plates. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. "Mighty fine pie, Miss McKenzie," Cross admitted after a few bites. "Now, about our arrangement." $10 a week," Sarah cut in smoothly. "That's what you're charging the other shops. But I have a counter-offer." Cross's eyes narrowed, but he gestured for her to continue. "Your men need to eat. I propose a trade. Fresh bread daily, pies when you want them, special orders, no questions asked. Better than cash, and less likely to draw attention from the law." "Interesting proposition." Cross stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "But what's to stop us from simply taking what we want?" Sarah's smile remained pleasant, though her spine stiffened. "Because that would be bad for business, Mr. Cross. Your business. A burned bakery makes no bread, and a dead baker bakes no pies. Besides," she gestured to the wanted poster of her father, "Lightning McKenzie's reputation still carries weight in these parts. Even if he's not here, people remember." "That old poster's just paper, miss. Times change." "They do indeed." Sarah topped off his coffee. "But good bread and loyal customers, that's constant. Ask around town. My goods are worth more than $10 a week, and they come with no questions, no trouble, and no worried townspeople writing to the territorial." "Marshal," Cross studied her for a long moment. Finally, he pushed back from the counter. "I'll consider your offer, but don't think being clever makes you safe. Sometimes a message needs sending, reputation or no. After they left, Sarah allowed herself a small shudder. She'd bought time, nothing more. The Raven gang wouldn't be satisfied with bread and pies for long. But time was what she needed. Time to think, to plan, to prepare. She cleaned the coffee cups with the same precision she used at the shooting range outside of town, where she still practiced before dawn when no one was watching. Every move efficient, every action purposeful. Like her father had taught her, the gang would be back. And when they came, they'd find out if lightning really could strike twice in the same place. Sarah knew something was wrong the moment she approached her bakery in the pre-dawn darkness. The street was too quiet, empty of even the earliest risers, who usually waited for her first batch of bread. A strange smell cut through the crisp morning air, not the familiar scent of wood smoke from her brick oven, but something sharper, chemical. She drew her father's Colt before reaching the door, movements smooth and practiced. The lock was broken, the door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, chairs had been overturned, display cases smashed. Her precious cake stands lay shattered on the floor, fragments of porcelain crunching beneath her boots. But it was the back of the shop that made her breath catch. They'd taken dynamite to her brick oven, the heart of her bakery. The explosion had been controlled, precise, designed to destroy her livelihood without burning down the whole building. Rubble and broken bricks covered her workbench, dusting the entire kitchen in red powder. Pinned to what remained of the oven was a note, written in elegant script that seemed at odds with its message. "Bread goes stale, Miss McKenzie, but a reputation for weakness lasts forever. Reconsider our original offer. Monsieur Cross." Sarah's hand tightened on her gun, trigger finger straight along the barrel, just as her father had taught her. Part of her wanted to ride straight to the Raven gang's camp, to show them exactly how weak Lightning McKenzie's daughter wasn't. But that was her father's way, quick, violent, leaving broken bodies and weeping widows in its wake. Miss Sarah. Young Tommy Wells, old Tom's grandson, came running up the street. They hit Peterson's again too, and the livery stable. 3 places in one night. She holstered the Colt, mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. The gang was making examples, demonstrating the cost of defiance. How long before examples turned to casualties? "Find Deputy Clark," she told Tommy. "Tell him what happened." But they both knew the law wouldn't help. The Raven gang had too many men, too many rifles, and too much reach for one deputy to handle. Sarah needed something else, someone else. Her father's name might still carry weight, but his guns would carry more. The last letter she'd received had been postmarked from Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. If she wrote now, how many more businesses would be destroyed before help arrived? How many lives would be ruined while she waited for lightning to ride to the rescue? Sarah stood in her ruined kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of her dream. She tried to build something different, something that didn't rely on her father's reputation or his guns. But the world wasn't ready to let her leave that legacy behind. Sometimes, her father's voice echoed in her memory, the kindest thing you can do is be cruel first. Strike hard, strike fast, and end it before worse comes. She brushed brick dust from her apron and began to write 2 lists in her precise baker's hand. The first was everything she'd need to repair the oven. The second was a very different kind of recipe, one that required bullets instead of butter, gunpowder instead of flour. The time for baking was over. Now it was time to show. The Raven gang, that Lightning McKenzie's daughter had inherited more than just his aim. The town council meeting erupted into chaos the moment Sarah walked in. Mayor Thompson's face was red with fury as he pounded his gavel. "Order! I will have order!" 3 businesses destroyed in one night, Peterson shouted from his seat. "How? Many more before we do something." "Do what?" Mrs. Henderson's voice quavered. "Fight them. They have 30 men at least, all armed." Sarah stood quietly at the back, watching the fear spread through the room like wildfire. These were good people. Ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers. They weren't gunfighters. They'd built Sweetwater with sweat and dreams, not bullets and blood. "Perhaps," Mayor Thompson suggested carefully, "if we were to negotiate a reasonable payment. Schedule with Mr. Cross." "Negotiate?" Sarah's voice cut through the babble. Every head turned toward her. "They destroyed my oven with dynamite. They burned Mr. Peterson's storeroom. That's not business, that's terrorism." She moved forward, steps measured, controlled. Just like her father had taught her. Command attention without demanding it. "If we pay them now, they'll only want more later. Protection money is like poison. A little bit kills you just as dead. As a lot. Then what do you suggest?" The mayor's tone was bitter. "Should we call for your father? Let Lightning McKenzie ride in and turn our streets into a shooting gallery?" The barb struck home, but Sarah didn't flinch. "My father's way isn't the only way to fight." "No!" Peterson laughed harshly. "What are you going to do, Miss McKenzie? Bake them into submission?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm going to give you a choice. We can either stand together now or fall apart one by one. But understand this, I won't pay them a penny. And I won't run." "Brave words," Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "But words won't stop bullets." Sarah felt the weight of her father's Colt against her ribs. "No," she agreed softly. "They won't." The meeting dissolved into more arguing, but Sarah had said her piece. Outside, the setting sun painted the street in shades of blood and gold. A rider was coming in fast, kicking up dust. Young Tommy Wells nearly fell off his horse in his hurry to reach her. "Miss Sarah, the gang, they're burning the Watson place. Old man Watson wouldn't pay, said they couldn't threaten a man who'd fought Indians. They're making an example." Sarah's heart clenched. John Watson was 70 if he was a day, a stubborn old pioneer who'd helped found the town. She looked back at the town hall, where the council was still debating whether to surrender or fight. No more time for debates. No more time for choices. She strode to the telegraph office, coins already in hand. The operator looked up nervously as she entered. "Send this to James McKenzie, care of the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne," she said, sliding a paper. Across the counter, the message was simple. "Raven gang terrorizing Sweetwater. Stop 30 men well armed. Stop Watson Place burning. Stop your daughter sends regards." Stop it wasn't quite a request for help. Her father would know what it meant, know that she wouldn't have contacted him unless the situation was dire, but she couldn't wait for him to arrive. The gang had forced her hand, and now they would learn what that meant. Sarah headed for her. Ruined bakery, mind already shifting from recipes to tactics. In her father's cedar chest, beneath the spare revolvers and gun oil, lay his old notebook. Everything he'd taught her about tracking, shooting, and survival was written there in his cramped hand. It was time to refresh her memory, and then it would be time to show the Raven gang that they hadn't just crossed Lightning McKenzie. They'd struck his daughter's lightning rod. Sarah spent the night studying her father's notebook by lamplight, fingers tracing his familiar scrawl. Between tactical diagrams and shooting techniques were little notes that made her smile despite the gravity of her situation. "Remember, Sadie girl, a man who spins his gun is just asking to drop it, and the fastest draw means nothing if you can't hit what you're aiming at." But it was his notes on strategy that held her attention now. "Power ain't about having the most guns," he'd written. "It's about making them think you have more than you do." Dawn found her at the remains of the Watson place, studying tracks. In the dirt, while early morning mist still clung to the ground. Old John Watson had survived, though his barn was ashes. The gang had made a show of it, taking their time, letting people gather to watch. Sloppy, overconfident. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Miss McKenzie." Deputy Clark materialized from the fog, looking haggard. The gang's been watching the roads. Good. Sarah didn't look up from the track she was examining. Let them watch. 15 men, based on these prints. Heavy horses, probably stolen from the Carson Ranch raid last month. They're camping somewhere within 2 hours' ride. Clark's eyebrows rose. How could you possibly know that? She pointed to dried mud on a fallen fence post. Red clay. Only gets that color up in Thunder Canyon. They'd need water for that many men and horses. The canyon's got the only reliable stream this time of year. Your father teach you that? Among other things. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her skirts. In her apron pocket, she carried more than just measuring spoons now. Tell me, Deputy, how many men actually patrol for the gang at night? He shifted, uncomfortably. 4, maybe 5. They rely on fear more than manpower. Most folks are too scared to cause trouble. And how many of those 15 men at the Watson place were actually gunmen? How many were just for show? Understanding dawned. In Clark's eyes, 6 carried rifles. The rest had pistols, but held them like boys with their first slingshots. Sarah nodded. The gang's real strength wasn't in numbers. It was in appearance, like an elaborately decorated cake hiding dry, flavorless layers beneath. Back in town, she found Tommy Wells waiting outside her ruined bakery, practically vibrating with excitement. Letter came for you, Miss Sarah, from Cheyenne. Her heart jumped, but the letter wasn't from her father. Instead, the Territorial Marshal's office reported that James McKenzie had left Cheyenne 2 weeks ago, heading north. They'd forward her message when they could. Sarah crumpled the letter, possibilities racing through her mind. She couldn't wait for her father. But maybe... Tommy, she said carefully. How'd you like to earn a silver dollar? The boy's eyes lit up. Yes, ma'am. I need you to ride out toward Miller's Creek. Stop at every ranch, every way station. Tell them Lightning McKenzie's on his way to deal with the Raven Gang. Tell them he's gathering men for a big push to clear the territory. But Miss Sarah, if he ain't really... Sometimes, Tommy, the threat of lightning is enough to make men seek and shelter. She pressed the coin into his hand. Just make sure plenty of people hear you, especially any strangers passing through. As Tommy rode off, Sarah returned to her bakery. The oven was still destroyed, but the front room was usable. She set out her father's guns on the counter, cleaning each one with the same care she'd once used on her cake decorating tools. The bell chimed. Marcus Cross stood in her doorway, taking in the arsenal laid out before her. Interesting display, Miss McKenzie. His voice was silk over steel. Though I heard lightnings up north, miles from here. Sarah continued cleaning the revolver in. Her hands, movements precise and practiced. News travels slow sometimes, but tell me, Mr. Cross, do you really want to be here when it catches up? He studied her for a long moment, noting how naturally she handled the weapon. You're playing a dangerous game, girl. No, Mr. Cross. She looked up, meeting his gaze. I'm baking something special. And like any good recipe, timing is everything. After he left, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The gang would have someone watching Tommy spread his news. Like yeast in warm water, rumors would begin to grow. Her father had taught her that fear worked both ways. Now she just had to survive long. Enough for her plan to rise. 2 days after Tommy Wells began spreading rumors of Lightning McKenzie's return, Sarah noticed the first changes. The gang's patrols doubled, then tripled. Their swagger had given way to nervous glances over shoulders, hands hovering closer to gun belts. They jumped at shadows, started at sudden movements. Fear was rising like well-proofed dough. Sarah put the time to good use. She'd converted her ruined kitchen into something her father would have appreciated. The destroyed oven made excellent. A cover, its broken bricks arranged to create firing positions. She'd reinforced the back door, installed metal shutters on the windows, and stored enough ammunition to hold off a small army. You're making them nervous, Deputy Clark warned, stopping. By with his daily report. He hadn't had a cherry Danish in days, but he'd gained something better, purpose. Cross sent riders out yesterday looking for confirmation about your father. Sarah measured out gunpowder with the same precision she once used for sugar. And flour? Good. Nervous men make mistakes. They're also dangerous, like rattlers backed into a corner. She nodded, thinking of her father's notes. The trick isn't backing them into a corner, deputy. It's making them think they're already there. Right on cue, hoofbeats approached. Sarah moved to the window, staying in shadow as she'd been taught. 3 of Cross's men rode past, rifles across their saddles. Their eyes darted everywhere, rooflines, alleyways, shadows, looking for Lightning McKenzie's ghost. Instead, they found his daughter, calmly sweeping her front step as if she hadn't a care in the world. "Morning, gentlemen," she called pleasantly. "Shame about your friend." The riders pulled up short. "What friend?" one demanded. Sarah returned to sweeping. "Oh, hadn't you heard? 2 of your scouts went missing up near Thunder Canyon last night. Thought maybe you were looking for them." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah hid her smile. There were no missing scouts, but they'd spend hours searching, wondering if Lightning McKenzie was already picking them off one by one. "You're lying," the lead rider growled, but his voice quavered. "Am I?" She leaned the broom against the wall. "Strange tracks up there this morning. Almost like someone was teaching somebody else to dance at gunpoint." She shrugged. "But I'm sure your friends are fine, probably just got lost, though I heard my father never did like men who got lost on his land. They spurred their horses onward, trying to hide their unease." Sarah watched them go, remembering her father's words. "Fear's like sourdough starter, Sadie girl. Feed it right, and it grows all on its own." Inside, she returned to her preparations. The gang wouldn't stay. Scared forever. Eventually they'd realize she was bluffing, or worse, decide to make an example of her. Before Lightning McKenzie could arrive, she had to be ready. "Miss Sarah!" Tommy Wells burst in, out of breath. "Riders coming in, least 6 of them from the east." Sarah's hand moved to her gun, but Tommy was grinning. "Not the gang. Looks like ranchers. Word spreading about Lightning coming back. They're saying they won't let the Raven gang push 'em around no more." She hurried to the door. Sure enough, a group of hard-looking men were riding into town, rifles prominent on their saddles. She recognized old John Watson among them, his face still soot-stained from his burned barn. "Miss McKenzie," he called out as they dismounted. "Heard your father's coming to clean house. Figured we might lend a hand." Sarah studied the group. These weren't gunslingers or desperados. They were ranchers, farmers, ordinary men who'd finally had enough. Just like her father always said, sometimes people didn't need a hero. They just needed someone to strike the first spark. "Mr. Watson," she said carefully, "my father's whereabouts are uncertain at the moment." The old man spat tobacco juice. "Don't much care. Way I figure, any man who raised a daughter willing to stand alone against 30 outlaws must have taught her something worth backing." A murmur of agreement ran through the group. Sarah felt something shift in the air, like the moment when bread dough finally comes together, transforming separate ingredients into something stronger. "Well then," she said, gesturing them inside, "let me show you what I've been planning." As she laid out her strategy, Sarah realized she wasn't just following her father's recipe anymore. She was creating something new, not with flour and yeast, but with courage and determination. And like any good baker, she knew exactly when it would be ready to serve. The signs were subtle at first. 2 of the Raven gang's best scouts were found tied to their horses, blindfolded and disarmed, with a lightning bolt carved into their saddles. A cache of the gang's weapons vanished overnight, replaced by wooden replicas painted to look real. Mysterious shots rang out whenever Cross's men tried to approach the Watson place, though no shooter was ever seen. Sarah noticed it all with mixed emotions. The work was precise, professional, exactly how her father would do it. But she hadn't heard from him directly, and these events carried a message. Someone was watching, intervening, but letting her handle things her own way. "Another one this morning," Deputy Clark reported, dropping into what had become his regular chair in her makeshift command center. "Found one of their lookouts hog-tied up in Thunder Canyon. Note pinned to him said, 'Lightning strikes twice.'" Sarah continued cleaning her rifle, movement steady and sure. "Interesting. And the gang's reaction? Cross is coming unraveled. Can't tell if it's really your father or just someone using his reputation. Either way, his men are starting to desert. 3 rode out last night, didn't even wait for their pay." She nodded, satisfied. Whether it was her father or just someone who knew his methods, the pressure was building. Like heat in an oven, it would eventually force something to rise or burn. The bell chimed as John Watson entered, leading a group of ranchers. They'd taken to gathering at her place in the evenings, planning defense strategies. The irony wasn't lost on her. A bakery turned war room. "Gangs pulling back from the outlying farms," Watson reported, "concentrating their forces closer to town, getting ready for something big, I reckon." "Or running scared," one of the younger ranchers suggested. "Between Lightning McKenzie's ghost and his daughter's steel, they're losing their grip." Sarah held up a hand. "Don't get overconfident. A cornered wolf is most dangerous when it's wounded." As if to prove her point, gunfire erupted from the street. Everyone dropped to practice positions as bullets shattered what remained of her front windows. Sarah moved to the reinforced firing port she'd created, scanning for targets. Marcus Cross stood in the middle of the street, 6 men flanking him. All of them held torches. "Enough games, Miss McKenzie," he shouted. "You want to play at being your father? Fine. Let's see how well you handle real violence." He hurled his torch at the nearest building, the dress shop. Flames caught quickly. In the dry wood, his men spread out, ready to turn the whole street into an inferno. Sarah's rifle cracked once. Cross's torch went flying, along with a fair piece of his hat brim. Her next shot knocked a torch from another man's hand before he could throw it. "That's 2, she called out calmly. "I've got 4 more shots in this rifle and 6 men still standing. Anyone want to test their luck against Lightning McKenzie's daughter?" A shot rang out from somewhere behind the gang, too far to be from her allies in the bakery. One of Cross's men yelped as his gun belt fell to the ground, cut clean through by a bullet. Another mysterious shot sent a torch spinning away before it could ignite the general store. Cross's men broke formation, diving for cover. But Sarah had already adjusted her aim, picking her targets with mechanical precision. Within seconds, the street was littered with dropped weapons and discarded torches. "Your men are bleeding away, Mr. Cross," she announced into the sudden quiet. "The smart ones are already running. How long before the rest realize you can't protect them from what's coming?" Cross fired blindly in her direction, but his shots went wide. Fear had ruined his aim. "You think you can scare us with parlor tricks and ghost stories? Your father's reputation won't save you." "No," Sarah agreed, chambering another round. "But my own might." A shot caught him in the gun arm, not fatal, but he wouldn't be drawing against anyone for a while. As his remaining men dragged him away, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement on a distant rooftop. A figure tipped its hat to her before vanishing into the gathering dusk. She smiled slightly, turning back to her allies. "Right then, let's get that. Fire out and set up proper watches. They'll be back, and next time they won't bother with warnings." Watson nodded approvingly. "You know, girl, you might not need your father's help after all." "Maybe not," Sarah agreed, thinking of that mysterious figure. "But it's nice to know lightning runs in the family." The Raven Gang's real leader arrived at noon the next day, riding a black stallion and wearing a black duster despite the summer heat. Roman Blackjack Hawley had built his reputation in the Dakota Territory, where he'd turned simple cattle rustling into an empire of terror. Now he sat his horse in the middle of Sweetwater's main street, studying Sarah's fortified bakery with cold eyes. "Quite a reputation you're building, Miss McKenzie," he called out, voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Making my lieutenant look like a fool, using your father's name to frighten my men. Very creative." Sarah watched him through a rifle port, noting details her father had taught her to recognize. The way his duster hung on the left side, hidden shotgun, the odd bulk in his saddle, extra ammunition, the careful distance he kept, just out of effective pistol range. "Wasn't trying to be creative, Mr. Hawley," she responded. "Just protecting what's mine." He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "A noble sentiment, but you see, this territory is mine now. Your father's reputation might have meant something once, but times change. The West isn't one with legends anymore. It's one with numbers and organization." To prove his point, riders appeared at both ends of the street. Sarah counted at least 20 men, all well armed. More moved into position on the rooftops of nearby buildings. It was a show of force meant to intimidate, but Sarah saw what Hawley didn't, the tension in his men's postures, the way they held their weapons too tight. They were scared. "Quite an army," she commented, "though I notice most of them are new. Faces, what happened to your original crew? The ones who've been terrorizing Sweetwater?" Hawley's smile tightened. They both knew what had happened. Between mysterious ambushes and her own precise counterstrikes, his original force had been whittled down to a handful of nervous men. These replacements were hired guns, bought with promises of easy money. "Last chance, Miss McKenzie. Surrender the bakery, leave town, and I'll let you live. Resist and—" He gestured to his men and their array of weapons. Sarah's finger rested lightly against her rifle's trigger, but she didn't aim. Not yet. "Interesting offer. I have one of my own. Look at your men's feet." Hawley frowned, then his eyes widened. Scattered around the street were small objects, barely visible in the dust. Her father's old tin containers, modified with percussion caps. Not enough powder to kill, but sufficient to create chaos. "First shot that's fired," she explained calmly. "It's one of those timing caps. Then things get messy. Your new men look jumpy. Think they'll hold formation when the ground starts exploding?" "You're bluffing," Hawley snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Maybe. Want to bet their lives on it?" Sarah's voice hardened. "You're right about one thing. Times have changed. The West isn't one with legends. It's won by people willing to stand their ground." As if to emphasize her point, movement appeared at windows and doorways up and down the street. Townspeople with rifles and shotguns covering every angle. "John." Watson's gravelly voice rang out from the gunsmith's shop. "Got you in my sights, Blackjack. Been waiting 40 years to use this buffalo gun. Range is perfect." Hawley's jaw clenched as he realized the trap. His men were bunched in the open, while Sarah had turned the whole street into a kill zone. Worse, these weren't just frightened townspeople anymore. They were citizens who'd learned to fight back. "Last chance," Sarah echoed his words. "Ride. Out now, leave Sweetwater alone and we'll let you go. Stay and find out exactly how much of my father's skill I inherited." For a long moment the street held its breath. Then Hawley wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, girl. You've made a terrible enemy today." "No," Sarah corrected as he rode away, his men following in disarray. "I've shown you what happens when you make enemies of honest people." After they'd gone, Watson joined her in the bakery. "Reckon that's the last we'll see of them?" Sarah shook, her head already reloading her rifle. "He'll be back. Men like that can't afford to lose face. But next time," she smiled grimly, "next time we'll be ready." She picked up one of the tin containers that had so worried Hawley. Watson squinted at it. "Those ain't really bombs, are they?" "Just empty tins," Sarah admitted. "But fears like baking powder, a little bit can make something seem much bigger than it is." Sarah waited until the moon was high before heading to the old barn behind her bakery. Inside, past the flour stores and delivery wagon, she rolled back a patch of seemingly solid floor to reveal her father's hidden practice range. As a child, she'd spent countless hours here, learning skills that went far beyond baking. The targets were still there, tin cans arranged at various distances, playing cards nailed to posts, and her father's special training dummy with its pivoting arms that held painted guns. In the moonlight streaming through the roof slats, she could almost see him standing there, patient and stern. "Speed is good, Sadie girl," he'd say, "but accuracy is everything. A vast miss is still a miss." She drew and fired in one fluid motion. The nearest can flew off its post. 2 more shots, 2 more cans down. The movements felt as natural as kneading dough, each action flowing into the next. "Miss Sarah?" "Tommy." Wells' voice startled her. The boy stood in the doorway, eyes wide. "That was amazing. I never seen anyone shoot so fast." Sarah holstered her gun with practiced ease. "You shouldn't be out this late, Tommy." "Was keeping watch like you asked." "Saw you come out here." He stepped closer, studying the targets. "Did lightning really teach you all his tricks?" "Some." Sarah picked up a fallen can, noting the perfect center hole. "But he taught me something more important, when to use them and when not to." "Is that why you never showed nobody before? Even when the gang first came?" She smiled slightly. "A baker who can outshoot most men. People would have been frightened. They needed to see me as just Sarah the baker first, to trust that I'd only use these skills when necessary." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Sarah moved silently to the barn door, Tommy right behind her. 3 riders were approaching. The bakery, gang members by their dress, but moving cautiously, almost fearfully. "They're checking if what Blackjack said was true," Tommy whispered. "About you being as good as your pa." Sarah's hand rested on her gun. "Let's not disappoint them." She stepped out into the moonlight, making no attempt to hide. The riders spotted her and reached for their weapons, but she was already moving. Her first shot knocked a gun from the nearest man's hand. Her second caught another's hat, spinning it off into the darkness. The third rider managed to clear leather, but Sarah's bullet struck his gun's hammer, rendering it useless. All 3 shots had come in less than 2 seconds. "Evening, gentlemen," she said calmly as they sat frozen on their horses. "Looking for something? Just seeing if the stories were true," one stammered. "Well, now you know. Ride back and tell Mr. Hawley what you saw. Tell him those weren't luck shots at the street today. Tell him why my father called me Little Lightning." They wheeled their horses and galloped away. Tommy emerged from the barn, practically bouncing with excitement. "That was better than any dime novel. You're just as fast as lightning." "Not quite." Sarah examined her gun thoughtfully. "Father could have done it with 3 shots in 1.5 seconds. I'm still a quarter second slow." "But why'd you let them go? Could have ended this right here." "Because now they'll talk, and their fear will spread faster than any bullet." She turned back to the barn. "Come on, since you're here, might as well teach you something useful." For the next hour, she showed Tommy the basics: stance, grip, sight picture. The same way her father had taught her, starting with an empty gun until the movements became natural. "Remember," she said as they finished, "this isn't about being the fastest or the deadliest. It's about being prepared to protect what matters. Like your bakery, like the whole town. Sweetwater's worth fighting for, Tommy. Not just the buildings and businesses, but the good people in it." She smiled. "Even if some of them do complain about my sourdough being too sour." As they walked back to the bakery, Sarah caught movement. On a distant rooftop, that familiar figure again, watching over them. She didn't wave or acknowledge it. Some recipes she'd learned worked best when you let them develop on their own. "Miss Sarah?" Tommy asked as they reached the back door. "Think Blackjack will really come back?" "Count on it. Men like that can't stand being shown up, especially by a woman." She checked her gun one last time before going inside. "But when he does, he'll find out that lightning can strike the same place twice, and the second strike is always deadlier than the first." Blackjack Hawley's camp buzzed with activity as his men prepared for what he promised would be their final assault on Sweetwater. Weapons were cleaned, ammunition distributed, and horses reshod. But Sarah had eyes everywhere now. Townspeople, who'd once lived in fear, had become her scouts, watching and reporting every movement. 40 riders at least, Deputy Clark reported, marking positions on the map spread across Sarah's counter. He's called in every favor, hired every gun hand. Between here and Dakota Territory. They're coming at dawn tomorrow. Sarah studied the map, her father's tactical lessons flowing through her mind. He's expecting us to fortify the center of town. That's why he's gathered so many men, planning to hit us from all sides at once. Can we hold against those numbers? She smiled slightly. We won't have to, because we're not going to be where he expects. Throughout the day, Sarah's allies implemented her plan. The town appeared to be preparing exactly as Hawley anticipated. Barricades went up around the main square. Citizens made a show of stockpiling ammunition in central buildings. But under cover of these obvious movements, other preparations were being made. John Watson supervised as men dug hidden rifle pits along the likely approach routes. Tommy Wells and other swift young riders set up an elaborate signal system using mirrors and flags. Women prepared medical supplies, but also gathered stockpiles of Sarah's special tin cans, now loaded with real black powder rather than just fear. It's like preparing for a big Sunday dinner, Sarah explained to Mrs. Henderson as they worked. Everything has to be ready at just the right time, in just the right place. Except the dinner guests are trying to kill us, the older woman noted dryly. That just means we need to be extra careful with the seasoning. As dusk approached, Sarah gathered her core defenders in the bakery. The former workspace now looked more like a military command post, with maps and weapons replacing rolling pins and cake pans. Hawley's confident, she told them, which means he'll be reckless. He's gathered impressive numbers, but most are hired guns. They're fighting for money. We're fighting for our homes. And our baker, Watson added with a wink. Town hasn't had a proper loaf of bread since this all started. Sarah appreciated his attempt at humor, but kept her focus. They'll come at dawn, hoping to catch us half asleep. Instead, we'll be waiting in positions they don't expect. Watson, your men know their posts? The old rancher nodded. Everyone, though some are still arguing about who gets to shoot black. Jack first. Nobody shoots unless I give the signal, Sarah said firmly. We need them committed to the attack before we spring our surprise. Deputy, the fallback points are ready. All set. Though I still say it's risky, letting them think they've pushed us back. Sometimes you have to let the dough fall a bit before it rises properly, Sarah replied, then caught herself using another baking metaphor. Her father would have laughed. He'd always said she'd find her own way of explaining tactics. A commotion outside drew their attention. One of Tommy's young scouts came running in out of breath. Riders approaching! Not the gang! Different direction! Sarah moved to the gee, window, rifle ready. Through the gathering darkness, she could make out a group of horsemen approaching from the east. Something about their formation seemed familiar. Army patrol? Watson suggested. No. Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle. Those are my father's men. 6 riders drew up in front of the bakery, trail-worn but alert. Their leader, a grizzled man Sarah recognized as her father's old deputy, touched his hat respectfully. Miss Sarah, your father sent us. Said you might need some experienced hands. Where is he? Handling some business up north. Said to tell you he trusts you'll manage fine without him, but thought you might appreciate some extra ingredients for whatever recipe you're cooking up. Sarah studied the men thoughtfully. They were veterans, gunfighters who'd ridden with her. Father for years. Their presence would certainly help, but they'd also change the dynamic of her carefully laid plans. Thank you for coming, she said finally. But understand this, tomorrow's fight happens my way. I'm not Lightning McKenzie, and I won't try to be. You want to help, you follow my lead, the old deputy smiled. Yes, ma'am. Your father said you'd say that. Also said anyone who didn't like it could ride on back north. None of the men moved. Sarah nodded. satisfaction and determination mingling in her chest. Dawn would bring violence to Sweetwater, but now she had everything she needed to meet it. "Right then," she said, turning back to her maps. "Let me show you how we're going to welcome Blackjack Holly to town." False dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Sarah revealed the final piece of her plan, one she'd kept secret even from her closest allies. In the bakery's cellar, behind stacks of flour barrels, she unlocked a heavy door. None of them had known existed. "Your father's gun room," the old deputy breathed, taking in the arsenal within. Rifles, shotguns, revolvers, enough firearms to equip a small army. But Sarah walked past these to a locked chest in the corner. "Not just his," she said quietly, opening the chest. Inside lay newspaper clippings, competition medals, and photographs that made the hardened gunman fall silent. They showed a younger Sarah, dressed as a boy, winning shooting competitions across 3 territories. In every image, she stood next to her father, both of them holding identical trophies. 7 years running," she explained. "We entered every major competition west of the Mississippi. Father would compete under his name. I'd compete under a cousin's. We both won our divisions every time." "That's why he called you Little Lightning," Watson realized. "You weren't just his student. You were his equal." Sarah lifted a custom revolver from the chest, its grip worn smooth by years of practice. "He never wanted me to live his life, but he made sure I could if I had to. Every morning before baking, every evening after closing, we'd practice, until the skills were as natural as breathing." The old deputy studied the competition photos with new understanding. "All this time, we thought you were just using his reputation for protection, but you're just as deadly as he ever was." "More," Sarah said simply. "Father relied on speed and accuracy. I learned to use people's assumptions against them. They see a baker's daughter, not a threat, right up until it's too late." She closed the chest and turned to face them. "That's why Blackjack's plan will fail. He's preparing to fight Lightning McKenzie's daughter, a girl trying to live up to her father's legend. Instead, he's going to face someone who's spent years perfecting her own style of warfare." Understanding dawned in their eyes. Every move she'd made suddenly made sense, letting the gang think she was bluffing, using their fear of her father while quietly building her own response. Even now, Hawley's men would be expecting her to fight like Lightning would, with direct confrontation and superior gunplay. The tin cans, the mirror signals, the hidden positions, Watson mused. "You've been leading them exactly where you want them." Sarah nodded. "Father taught me that the fastest draw doesn't matter if you're shooting at the wrong target. Hawley's gathered 40 gunmen to face Lightning McKenzie's ghost. Instead, they're walking into a trap set by a baker who knows. Timing isn't just about speed, it's about making sure everything comes together at exactly the right moment." She began distributing weapons with practiced efficiency. "Dawn's coming. Get to your positions. And remember, no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, stick to the plan. Sometimes the best recipes require patience." As her allies filed out, Sarah caught the old deputy's sleeve. "One more thing. If my father sent you here, he must have told you something else." "What was it?" The grizzled man's face creased in a rare smile. "He said to tell you he's proud, said you turned out to be a better baker than he ever was a gunfighter. Though," he added with a meaningful look at the competition photos, "I don't think he was talking about bread." Blackjack Hawley was reviewing his battle plans when one of his scouts burst into camp, pale as morning frost. The man's hands shook as he handed over a weathered competition poster he'd found in a nearby town. It showed a young boy named Samuel McKenzie winning the Dakota Territory Quick Draw Championship, but Hawley recognized the face beneath the worn cap. "It's her," the scout stammered. "Been her all along. Lightning didn't just teach her, he competed against her. They say she matched him shot for shot, target for target." Hawley studied the poster, his confident smirk fading. he'd been preparing to face a girl playing at being her father's daughter. Instead, he was facing someone who'd spent years mastering both deception and marksmanship. "She's been leading us around by the nose," he growled. "All that business with her father's reputation, making us look for Lightning's ghost, it was just smoke and mirrors while she set up her real trap." In Sweetwater, word of Sarah's true capabilities spread like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson burst into the bakery, where Sarah was making final preparations, waving an old newspaper clipping. "You won the Cheyenne Ladies Auxiliary Baking Competition and the Territorial Shooting Match on the same day," she demanded. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Sarah continued, checking ammunition with practiced efficiency. "Would you have let me bake your daughter's wedding cake if you'd known I could? Outshoot most men? Well, Mrs. Henderson paused, then squared her shoulders. "Yes, because you make the best vanilla sponge in 3 territories, and apparently you've been protecting us all along, whether we knew it or not." Out on the street, Tommy Wells was proudly telling anyone who'd listen about Sarah's hidden shooting range and the lessons she'd been giving him. "She says solving problems is like baking. You need the right ingredients, the right timing, and sometimes you have to let things heat up before they're ready." Deputy Clark found Sarah in her father's gunroom, making final adjustments to her. "Revolvers. You knew," he said quietly. "Knew they'd underestimate you because of your bakery. Knew they'd be looking for your father's style of fighting. This whole time, you've been using their expectations against them." She nodded, not looking. Up from her work. "Father taught me that the best advantage is the one your enemy gives you freely. They chose to see what they expected. A woman trying to live up to her father's legend, not someone who'd spent years building her own. And now they know. Which means tomorrow's fight will be different than they planned." She smiled slightly. "They'll be ready for Lightning McKenzie's style, direct, aggressive, overwhelming force. Instead, they'll get something else entirely." "What's that?" "A baker's approach. Timing, patience, and knowing exactly when things are ready to come out of the oven." Back in the gang's camp, Hawley gathered his lieutenants. "Change of plans," he growled. "Forget everything you know about Lightning McKenzie. His daughter's been playing a deeper game. She's turned the whole town into a weapon, and we've been dancing to her tune. What do we do?" one man asked, eyeing the competition poster nervously. "We hit hard, hit fast before dawn. No more games, no more strategy. Burn it all and kill anyone who resists." But even as he gave the orders, Hawley felt the first tremors of doubt. He'd come to Sweetwater expecting to crush a young woman, trading on her father's reputation. Instead, he'd found someone who'd taken her father's lessons and transformed them into something entirely new. As night fell over Sweetwater, Sarah stood at her bakery window, watching Hawley's men prepare for their attack. Behind her, the town's defenders moved quietly into their positions, following her carefully laid plans. "Your father would be proud," the old deputy said, checking his rifles one last time. "Maybe," Sarah replied softly. "But tomorrow isn't about making him proud. It's about showing them why they should have worried less about Lightning's legacy and more about who I am now." The hours before dawn stretched like pulled taffy, sweet with anticipation and heavy with tension. Sarah moved through Sweetwater's darkened streets, checking positions, adjusting plans, making sure every piece of her strategy was in place. Her father had taught her that preparation was everything. A gunfight's won or lost before the first shot, he'd say, but these weren't his preparations. Where Lightning McKenzie would have set up firing positions and planned fields of fire, Sarah had turned the entire town into an elaborate trap. Every street held surprises, every building concealed more than just defenders. Riders approaching. From the south, Tommy reported, breathless from running. "They're gathering in the hills, just like you said they would." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. She'd studied Hawley's previous attacks, noted his patterns. Like many men, he was predictable in his aggression. How many? 43 by my count. Split into 4 groups, just starting to move into position, exactly as she'd expected. Hawley would want to attack from multiple directions, thinking he could overwhelm her defenses through sheer numbers. He still didn't understand that she wasn't fighting like her father would. In the bakery, now serving as their command center, John Watson and the old deputy were reviewing the final preparations with the town's defenders. Miss Sarah's marked everyone's positions, Watson explained, pointing to the map. When the shooting starts, stick to your assignments. Don't get drawn into their kind of fight. They'll try to push us toward the center of town, Sarah added, entering with Tommy. Let them think it's working. Like bread dough, sometimes things need to be pressed down before they can rise properly. A nervous chuckle rippled through the group. They'd gotten used to her baking metaphors, finding comfort in how she could make warfare sound like a familiar recipe. What about the explosives? One of the ranchers asked. All that black powder under the street is perfectly safe unless they do exactly what Hawley's planning. Sarah checked her father's revolver, more out of habit than necessity. Just remember, when you hear the church bell, be ready to move fast. Outside, the pre-dawn air crackled with tension. Sarah could almost taste it, like the moment before lightning strikes. Her scouts reported Hawley's men taking up their positions, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They're surrounding the town, Deputy Clark reported. Got sharpshooters setting up on the ridge, mounted men ready to charge in from all sides. It's an impressive force. It would be, Sarah agreed, if they were fighting the battle they're expecting. She turned to Tommy. Get the signal flags ready. When this starts, timing will be everything. The boy nodded eagerly but hesitated. Miss Sarah, are you scared? She considered the question carefully. Not of them, but I'm scared of what could happen to Sweetwater if we fail. That's why we won't. More reports came in as Hawley's force finished their preparations. Sarah listened to each one, noting details, adjusting her mental map of the coming battle. Her father had taught her to read men like most women read recipes, noting their ingredients, their tendencies, their weaknesses. Dawn's coming soon, the old deputy observed. Your father would usually be giving a speech about now, something about standing firm and fighting for what's right. Sarah smiled slightly. I'm not my father, and these good people don't need speeches. They need to trust the plan. Like a good sourdough, it just needs time to develop properly. She gathered her core defenders one last time, speaking quietly but firmly. Remember, let them think they're winning, let them push into town, let them believe their numbers are overwhelming us. When they're fully committed, when they think victory is certain, that's when we show them why they should have worried less about Lightning's reputation and more about the storm that was brewing right under their noses. The first hints of grey touched the eastern sky. Soon, Hawley would launch his attack, expecting to face Lightning McKenzie's style of warfare, direct, aggressive, overwhelming. Instead, he would find that Sarah had learned more from baking than just how to make bread rise. She had learned patience, timing, and the art of letting things develop at exactly the right pace. Most importantly, she had learned that the best recipes don't always follow tradition. Sometimes they create something entirely new. The first shots came with the dawn, just as Sarah had predicted. Hawley's sharpshooters opened fire from the ridge, trying to pin down defenders while mounted men charged from 4 directions. The thunder of hooves mixed with gunfire as 40 riders stormed toward Sweetwater. Sarah watched calmly from her position in the bakery's 2nd floor. Through the pre-dawn gloom, she could make out Blackjack Hawley himself, leading the largest group of riders. His black duster billowed behind him like a storm cloud. Here they come, Tommy whispered from his post by the signal flags. Shouldn't we start shooting back? Not yet. Sarah's voice was steady as she counted the riders entering her kill zone. Let them commit fully first. Like pastry dough, try to work it too soon, and it just falls apart. The gang's initial charge met only scattered resistance. A few defenders fired from obvious positions, then appeared to retreat in panic. Hawley's men pressed forward, growing confident as they pushed deeper into town. "They're falling for it," John Watson observed from his hidden position across the street. "Thinking we're running scared." Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see her. Everything was proceeding exactly as she'd planned. Hawley's men were following the most obvious routes into town, channeling themselves naturally into her prepared positions. They thought they were herding the defenders. In reality, they were being herded themselves. "Tommy," she said quietly, "first signal." The boy waved his flags in a precise pattern. Across town, hidden defenders began implementing Sarah's strategy, not with direct gunfire, that would have been her father's way. Instead, they triggered the first of her carefully planned surprises. Smoke bombs exploded in the street, crafted from her baking supplies and black powder. The thick clouds divided Hawley's forces, creating confusion. Riders pulled up short, losing formation as they tried to peer through the haze. "Second signal," Sarah ordered. More flags waved. Ropes pulled taut across alleyways. Barrels rolled. Into carefully chosen positions, the gang's neat formation dissolved into chaos as horses stumbled and riders were forced to dismount. "Getting mighty complicated out there," the old deputy commented, watching Hawley's men struggling to regroup. "That's the idea." Sarah checked her pocket watch. "In baking, if you don't control the process, it controls you. Same with a battle." Hawley's voice carried over the confusion, shouting orders as he tried to restore order. "Push forward. They're trying to delay us. Get to the town square." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Even now, he thought he understood her strategy. Thought she was playing for time, perhaps waiting for reinforcements. He still didn't see the real trap. "Miss Sarah," Tommy called urgently. "They're starting to regroup. Moving toward the square, just like you said they would." "Good." She made a few quick adjustments to her mental timeline. "Time for the next step. Give the signal for Phase 2. More flags waved. Across town, defenders began their staged retreat, drawing Hawley's men forward with the promise of easy victory. The gang's forces consolidated, pressing toward what they thought was the defenders' last stronghold. "They're bunching up," Watson reported. "Getting awful confident." "Pride before the fall," Sarah murmured. She watched as more of Hawley's men dismounted, preparing for what they thought would be the final push. They were gathering exactly where she wanted them, their positions chosen by their own tactical assumptions. "Shouldn't we start shooting back for real?" Tommy asked, clearly anxious. "They're getting awful close." "Patience," Sarah advised. "Father always said most men defeat themselves through impatience. We just have to wait for the right moment," she studied the battlefield with a baker's eye, noting how all her ingredients were coming together. Hawley's men were compressed into the streets leading to the square, hemmed in by their own eagerness and her subtle manipulations. They thought they were winning, thought they had the defenders trapped. "Just like a good loaf," she said softly. "Everything has to be in the right place before you apply the heat." Tommy looked puzzled. "Miss Sarah? What does bread have to do with—" The first explosion cut him off, not from gunfire or defensive positions, but from beneath the street itself. Sarah's real trap was beginning to spring, and Hawley was about to learn that he'd underestimated more than just her shooting skills. The street erupted beneath Hawley's men. Sarah's hidden charges, carefully placed and precisely timed, transformed Sweetwater's main thoroughfare into chaos. Not lethal explosions. She wasn't her father, dealing death from every angle. Instead, she'd calculated each blast to create maximum confusion with minimal casualties. "Now," she commanded, and her defenders opened fire from their concealed positions. Not wild shooting, but careful, aimed shots that sent Hawley's men scrambling for cover that wasn't there. Every doorway they dove toward, every alley they tried. To escape down had been prepared in advance. "They're boxed in," Tommy exclaimed, watching through his spyglass. "Just like you said they'd be." Sarah was already moving, her father's revolver in hand as she made her way to street level. The gang's forces had fractured exactly as she'd planned, separated into manageable groups, their confidence shattered, their numerical advantage rendered useless by the terrain she'd engineered. "Miss Sarah!" Watson called out in warning as 3 of Hawley's men charged around a corner. She dropped the first with a shot to the leg, disarmed the second with a precise bullet that struck his gun's hammer, and let Watson handle the third. "Getting fancy with those shots," the old deputy commented, covering her advance. "Precise," Sarah corrected, reloading smoothly. "Like measuring ingredients. Too much or too little, and the whole recipe fails." Through the smoke and confusion, she caught glimpses of her strategy bearing fruit. Hawley's men were surrendering in groups, realizing they were trapped in a maze of their own making. The few who tried to fight back found themselves facing defenders who knew exactly where they would run, exactly how they would react. "It's not just the shooting," Tommy realized, watching from his position. "You knew where they'd go, what they'd do. Everything. People are predictable when they're scared or angry," Sarah replied, remembering her father's lessons. "Like dough rising. Give it the right conditions, and it'll do exactly what you expect." A shot rang out, closer than the others. Blackjack Hawley emerged from the smoke like a devil from the pit, his fancy duster torn and dirty, but his gun hand steady. "Clever girl," he snarled, keeping his revolver trained on her. "Very clever. Used our own assumptions against us. Made us think we were fighting Lightning McKenzie's way when you had something else planned all along. You could have just left Sweetwater alone," Sarah answered calmly, noting the positions of her allies without taking her eyes off Hawley. "Could have found easier targets, safer profits, and let some baker's daughter make a fool of me." He laughed harshly. "No, this was always going to end with blood, though I admit I didn't expect quite this much creativity." "That was your mistake." Sarah's voice hardened. "You were so busy looking for Lightning's ghost, you didn't see what was right in front of you." "Well, I see you now." Hawley's finger tightened on his trigger. "Let's find out if you really are as fast as your father. That's your second mistake." Sarah didn't move for her gun, didn't shift her stance. "Still thinking this is about speed?" Hawley's eyes narrowed, then widened as he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Sarah had saved one last surprise, a carefully undermined section of street, waiting for just the right pressure. The earth crumbled beneath him. Not enough to kill, but more than enough to spoil his aim. Sarah drew and fired in one smooth motion, striking his gun hand with surgical precision. Hawley's revolver went flying as he stumbled to his knees. "You see, Mr. Hawley," Sarah said, keeping him covered as her allies emerged from their positions. "Father taught me that a gunfight is won or lost before the first shot. But baking taught me that timing and preparation matter more than raw speed." Around them, the last pockets of resistance were surrendering. Tommy's signal flags waved triumphantly, reporting success from all quarters. Sarah's plan had worked perfectly. Like a well-timed souffle, everything had risen exactly as intended. "Your father would have just shot us all," Hawley muttered, as Deputy Clark clapped him in irons. "My father's way was effective," Sarah agreed, holstering her gun. "But it left too many widows, too many orphans. Sometimes the best victory is the one that leaves both sides alive to learn from it." She turned to survey her town. Sweetwater had survived, its people had grown stronger, and they'd done it their own way. Not with Lightning's swift brutality, but with careful planning and controlled pressure. Just like a perfect loaf of bread. A week after Blackjack Hawley's defeat, Sarah McKenzie reopened her bakery. The brick oven had been rebuilt, the floors scrubbed clean of gunpowder residue, and the scent of fresh bread once again wafted through Sweetwater's main street. But subtle changes remained. like the way customers noticed her precise movements with new appreciation, or how young boys practiced their quick-draw techniques with rolling pins. "Best cinnamon rolls west of the Mississippi," Deputy Clark declared, settling into what had become his regular spot at the counter. "And the fastest gun hand, too, though folks are being more polite about mentioning that part." Sarah smiled as she added extra icing to his roll. "They'll get used to it. People adapt to all sorts of things, given time and proper preparation." The town had indeed adapted. Hawley and his surviving men were in territorial custody, facing justice for their crimes, but more importantly, Sweetwater had found its strength. The citizens who'd united under Sarah's leadership maintained their bonds, creating a network of mutual support that would discourage future threats. "Got another letter from your father," Tommy announced, bringing in the morning mail. The boy had appointed himself her unofficial assistant, both in baking and in keeping watch over the town. Sarah opened the letter, recognizing her father's cramped handwriting. "Dearest Sadie girl, word of your victory spreads far and wide. They're calling. The Sweetwater strategy, how a baker's precision beat a gang's brute force. Some say you've created a new way of handling trouble out here, one that leaves less blood and more understanding in its wake. I couldn't be prouder. Love, Pa P.S. Your mother always said you'd find your own path. Guess baking wasn't as far from gunfighting as I thought." "Miss Sarah," Tommy asked as she folded the letter away, "think we'll have more trouble? Other gangs looking to make a name?" "Probably," she admitted, checking her rising dough. "But they'll find more than Lightning McKenzie's legacy waiting for them now. They'll find a town that knows how to defend itself, and a baker who's learned to mix justice with mercy." The morning sun streamed through her newly repaired windows, catching the edge of her father's old wanted poster. But beside it now hung a different kind of paper, her own awards and recognitions no longer hidden away. Both the shooter's prizes and the baking championships displayed with equal pride. "Like any good recipe," she told Tommy as she pulled another perfect batch of sourdough from the oven. "The secret isn't in any single ingredient. It's in knowing how to bring everything together at just the right moment." She glanced at her father's gun, now openly displayed above the counter alongside her rolling pins and cake molds. "Sometimes the best traditions are the ones we adapt to make our own." Outside, Sweetwater went about its business, changed but stronger. And inside her bakery, Sarah McKenzie continued her work, knowing that whether she was wielding a gun or a whisk, the true measure of success wasn't in the tools you used, but in the care you took in using them.